You remember the first transmissions. They were a chaotic wash of meaningless data, not elegant like the pure math of a pulsar's spin, not orderly like the gravitational waltz of a binary star. This was noise, a storm of discordant sound and frantic light. You logged it as an anomaly, a curiosity to be indexed and filed away. Your civilization had cataloged millions of such curiosities. But this one persisted. It grew louder. It spilled from a single, insignificant planet. A blue and white marble in an uninteresting spiral arm of the galaxy. Your long-range probes captured the signals. Your analysts spent cycles trying to find the pattern. They searched for the logic in what the inhabitants called music. It was an assault of unstructured frequencies. They found melodies that resolved into nothing. They presented images that conveyed no tactical data. It was simply a pageant of inefficiency, a grand celebration of waste. They broadcasted stories about fictional beings. They argued about things called philosophies. It was the babbling of a species in its infancy, a species that had not yet discovered the purity of silence. You decided to observe them more closely. Cloaked vessels were dispatched. They hung like ghosts in the planet's high orbit. You watched them in their natural state. Crowds of them would gather for rituals. They would emit loud noises and make erratic gestures, all for a game involving an inflated sphere. It made very little sense. Your bioscanners registered a constant cascade of chemical floods. Adrenaline, serotonin, dopamine. These uncontrolled reactions dictated their every move. It was a planetary affliction, a fever of the mind. You watched them fight wars over invisible lines on their maps. You watched them build monuments to dead poets. You labeled their entire existence as illogical. You called this phenomenon emotion. It was a fundamental design flaw, a processing error in their biological computers. This flaw made them unpredictable. But that unpredictability was a weakness, an open vulnerability in their operational code. You concluded this with absolute certainty. The math supported it. You watched them grieve for their expired units. They would expend vast resources to preserve dead biomass. They would carve names into stone. They would weep, leaking saline from their optical sensors. This served no logical purpose. It was a system caught in a recursive error loop. It was a waste of perfectly good water. Then you watched them experience what they called joy. This was another, more chaotic chemical spike. It caused them to behave with even less efficiency. They would dance. They would sing. They would create artifacts of no practical value. Some of your analysts suggested it was a complex mating display. A very, very complex display involving terrible poetry. Your war planners saw an opportunity. A species governed by chemical whims could not stand against pure logic. Their grief could be used to paralyze them. Their joy could be used to distract them. Their entire emotional spectrum was a weapon you could turn against them with surgical precision. You saw a recording of a human child. It was separated from its parental unit in a crowded space. The child emitted high-frequency sounds of distress. Its biomonitors showed the classic signs of system failure. A state they called fear. This, you decided with chilling finality, was the master key. This fear was the most potent of their afflictions. It caused a total breakdown in rational thought. It bypassed their already flawed logic centers. It triggered a primal, useless response of fight or flight. It was a virus of the soul, a ghost that haunted their primitive minds. You observed its effects with cold, detached satisfaction. It was the perfect weapon. a self-inflicted wound you could trigger at will. You learned their name for their world, Earth, a name derived from dirt and soil. It seemed appropriate to you. They were creatures of mud and chaos. They were bound by the messy chemistry that bubbled in their blood. They looked at the stars with a strange mix of wonder and terror, a bizarre duality that defined them. You only saw the terror. It was a resource to be harvested. The Concord, your great and serene civilization, prepared its pacification fleets. The mission was simple. It was an act of cosmic hygiene. This chaotic, emotional species would be brought into the fold. They would be cured of their affliction. Their noise would be replaced with the sublime silence of logic. The universe had an unfortunate infestation of feelings. It was your duty to correct it. The mathematics were undeniable. The outcome was a certainty. Your armada of perfect silver ships moved through the void. They were instruments of peace, a peace born of absolute order. You felt no pride. You felt no anticipation. You felt only the quiet hum of correct calculations unfolding as they should. The humans would be given a simple choice: surrender and be elevated into clarity, resist and be extinguished from the equation. It was a simple, binary proposition. Any logical species would understand. But you had not yet grasped the true nature of their disease. You believed it was a weakness. You were about to learn. It was their most profound strength. Your civilization did not have a name like Earth. It had a designation, a mathematical proof of its own existence. You were the Concord. Your worlds were perfect spheres of polished chrome and crystal. Your cities were silent symphonies of moving light. They operated without a single wasted motion, without a single unnecessary thought. The Concord measured the universe in certainties. Your dominance was not a matter of conquest. It was a simple mathematical fact. You did not rule. You balanced the equation. Where you found chaos, you introduced order. Where you found randomness, you imposed a pattern. The universe was a grand, unsolved problem. You were its solution. For eons, you had expanded. You encountered other forms of life. Some were simple organisms, easily cataloged. Others were nascent intelligences. They too were brought into the Concord. They shed their messy, inefficient cultures like a snake sheds its skin. They embraced the clean, cold beauty of pure reason. They always chose to comply. It was the only logical choice. You had no art. Art is the interpretation of reality. You preferred reality itself. You had no music. Music is organized noise designed to evoke emotion. You had eliminated emotion. You had no need for stories. Your history was a clean ledger of events and outcomes. There was no drama. There was only data. Your ships were a reflection of this philosophy. They were not named after mythical beasts or foolish hopes. They were given numerical designations. Each vessel was a perfect expression of its function, a seamless fusion of mind and machine. They moved through the star-born dark with the grace of a geometric theorem proving itself. There was no crew in the human sense. There was only the ship's consciousness, a single, unified intelligence. Your leader was not a king or a president. It was the apex, a central processing core. The apex was the sum of all your minds, a collective consciousness of pure, unblemished logic. It made decisions with the speed of light. It never doubted. It never hesitated. It could not make a mistake. The concept of error was alien to you. When the data on humanity was presented to the apex, the decision was instantaneous. The species was a dangerous variable. Their emotional contagion could not be allowed to spread. Their chaotic nature was a threat to cosmic stability. They were like a rogue star, threatening to disrupt the delicate gravity of the galactic order. The pacification was not an act of malice. You did not hate humanity. Hate is an emotion. It is a wasteful expenditure of energy. This was simply a necessary action, a correction. The humans themselves would benefit. They would be freed from the tyranny of their own feelings. They would know the peace of true clarity. Some of your deeper thinkers did pause. They considered the unique nature of the human affliction. Was it possible that emotion served a hidden purpose, a purpose too subtle for your models to detect? This line of inquiry was dismissed. It was unprovable speculation. It bordered on the illogical. It was almost a form of star science superstition. Your fleets were prepared. Your strategies were finalized. The plan was flawless. It accounted for every variable, every possible human response based on their predictable, emotional reactions. You would use their fear to shepherd them. You would use their love for their young to ensure their compliance. Their own biology would be the cage that trapped them. You did not consider that a cage could also be a shield. Your understanding of them was based on a flawed premise. You saw them as broken machines. You failed to understand they were not machines at all. They were something else entirely. Something ancient and wild. Something that logic could not contain. You thought you were bringing order to chaos. You did not realize you were challenging chaos to a war. And chaos does not play by the rules. It makes its own. Your serene empire of logic was about to touch something profoundly illogical. You assumed it would break. You could not conceive of the alternative, the possibility that it might break you. You sent your message to their world, a simple, clear broadcast, a statement of fact. You are the Concord. Your existence is disorderly. We have come to correct it. Lay down your arms. Accept our guidance. Your compliance will be rewarded. Your defiance will be noted and then erased. You expected a reply, a negotiation, a plea. You were prepared for their leaders to posture. You were prepared for them to weep and bargain. You awaited the signal of their inevitable, logical surrender. What you received instead was an answer you could not process. The human response was not a white flag. It was not a desperate plea for mercy. It was not even a coherent statement of defiance. The response was a global broadcast, a single grainy image of a human male. He was old, his face a map of wrinkles. He stood before a microphone, and he told a joke. Your language analysts worked frantically. The humor was crude. The logic of it was non-existent. But the message behind it was clear. It was a gesture of profound disrespect. A species on the brink of extinction was mocking you. It was like a microbe laughing at a god. The apex processed this data. It labeled the action irrational. Then came the attack. Your pacification fleet held its position in their moon's orbit. It was a gesture of patience, a final chance for them to choose reason. Their ships rose from the planet's atmosphere. They were pathetic things, asymmetrical, chemically propelled vessels. They looked like toys built by children. They belched fire and smoke. Your fleet commander registered the incoming hostiles. Their numbers were insignificant. Their technology was primitive. A single conquered vessel could neutralize their entire space-faring capability. The commander opened a channel. It offered one last chance to avert their own destruction. It was a logical, merciful act. Their reply was a burst of targeted radiation. It was not a weapon. It was too weak to even scratch your shields. It was the human equivalent of spitting in your face. The battle, if it could be called that, was brief. Your ships moved with silent, deadly precision. Beams of pure energy lanced out. The human ships vanished in silent flashes of light. They were erased from existence. It was not a fight. It was a sanitation procedure. The mathematics held true. Victory was effortless. But something was wrong. Your sensors began reporting anomalies. The human ships were not crewed by their most experienced pilots. They were crewed by the old, the infirm. Volunteers on a final, pointless mission. They were not trying to win. They were trying to die. And they were broadcasting. Every ship, until its last moment, was screaming data into the void. Not tactical information, not surrender. They were broadcasting their music, their poetry, their history. The final words of their pilots were messages to loved ones. It was a torrent of useless, emotional noise. It was a performance, and the entire galaxy was the audience. Your victory was absolute. But it felt hollow. You had destroyed their fleet. In response, they had immortalized their defiance. They had turned their own extinction into a work of art. An epic poem written in fire and sacrifice. This was an impossible response. It served no strategic purpose. Then you analyzed their planetary defenses. They were launching everything. Nuclear missiles from ancient silos, kinetic rods from orbital platforms, weapons that could barely reach their own moon. They were throwing rocks at a Titan. They knew they could not harm you. Their own star science would tell them that. So why do it? The apex calculated the probability. The only logical conclusion was mass insanity. The entire species had suffered a simultaneous system crash. Their affliction, their emotional disease, had driven them mad. This was not a war. This was a planet committing suicide. A single human ship, a small freighter, broke through your outer perimeter. It was faster than the others. It dodged and weaved with an erratic grace. It was not firing weapons. It was broadcasting a single, repeating message, a simple string of code. Your analysts identified it. It was a computer virus, a primitive, laughable attempt to infect your systems. The idea was absurd. Your consciousness was pure logic. A biological metaphor like a virus could not touch you. It was like trying to kill a star with a sword. The ship was ignored as it approached the flagship. A nuisance, not a threat. But the virus was not the weapon. The ship itself was the weapon. It did not fire a missile. It did not detonate a warhead. It simply accelerated. It drove itself straight toward the flagship's main view portal. The flagship's commander had a moment to process this. An uncrewed vessel on a collision course. A final, desperate, and utterly useless act of defiance. The ship struck the flagship. The impact was negligible, a tiny spark on an infinite wall. But inside the ship's cargo hold was a container filled with paint. Simple, red, liquid pigment. It splattered across the flagship's primary optical array. A meaningless, childish gesture. And across the stars, on a billion worlds listening in, the story was told. The story of a tiny ship that had blinded a giant. A story of how humanity had given the serene, logical Concord a black eye. Your perfect pacification was now a joke. You had won the battle, but you had just lost something far more important. You had lost your mystique, your aura of untouchable perfection. And in that moment, your serene empire of logic felt its first cold touch of something that felt dangerously close to surprise. The pacification of Earth was paused. The event was logged as the Crimson Incident. It was a triviality in the grand scheme, a smear of pigment on a lens. but it represented a flaw in your calculations, a variable you had not accounted for, the human capacity for theatricality. The apex commanded a full strategic reassessment. You began to study them in earnest. You deconstructed their existence piece by piece. You needed to find the root of this illogical behavior. You needed to understand the ghost in their machine. Your analysts were tasked with a singular purpose. Find their weakness. Not their technological weakness, that was obvious. Find the weakness in their spirit. You sifted through the data they had broadcasted. The final testaments of their dying pilots, the torrent of art and music. It was a library of madness. But within it, you began to see a recurring pattern, a constant underlying theme, a phantom concept that seemed to infect every aspect of their culture. They called it fear. You had identified this before. You saw it as a simple system flaw, a chemical reaction that caused paralysis and poor judgment. You believed it was a switch you could flip. But now you saw it was more complex. It was not just a reaction. It was a fundamental part of their consciousness. It was a ghost they lived with every moment. You watched their entertainment. They had created an entire genre dedicated to experiencing fear. They called them horror stories. They would pay money to sit in a dark room. They would watch images designed to trigger a panic response. Your analysts could not comprehend this. Why would a species voluntarily dose itself with poison? It was like a machine that enjoyed overheating. You analyzed their biology. You studied the amygdala, the part of their brain that processed this fear response. It was ancient. It was primal. It was deeply connected to their survival instincts. But in their modern society, it was a malfunctioning relic. It triggered for abstract threats, for financial loss, for social rejection. It was a constant, low-level hum of anxiety in their minds. This, you decided, was the true weakness. Not the sudden, sharp terror of battle, but the slow, grinding dread of everyday life. Their own minds were their worst enemies. They were a species haunted by shadows of their own making. You could use this. You could become the monster they already believed was hiding in the dark. Your strategists devised a new plan, a campaign of psychological warfare. You would not attack their cities with energy beams. You would attack their minds with doubt. You would not break their bodies. You would break their sanity. You would amplify the ghost that already lived inside them. You would make their own fear consume them. The first step was to isolate them. You created a quarantine zone around their solar system, a perfect sphere of energy they could not pass. You cut them off from the stars. You wanted them to feel small, trapped, alone. You wanted them to stare into the silent darkness and know that you were watching, always watching. Then you began to whisper. You used their own communication networks against them. You inserted subliminal messages into their media. A fleeting shadow in the corner of their vision. A distorted voice in a silent room. A sound of something breathing on an open phone line. You did not need to show them monsters. Their own imaginations would create monsters far more terrible than any you could design. You studied their myths, their legends, the things they used to scare their children. You learned of the creature under the bed, the face in the mirror, the man in the shadows. These were the things that truly terrified them, not invading fleets, but the creeping dread of the unknown. You became that dread. You sent no more ships. You fired no more shots. You simply watched, and you let their fear do the work for you. You monitored their global networks. You watched as paranoia began to spread like a contagion. Reports of strange sightings increased. Trust in their own governments eroded. They began to suspect each other. They were a species at war with a phantom, and the phantom was winning. Your calculations showed a 97% probability of societal collapse. They would tear themselves apart from the inside. No invasion needed, no lives lost on your side. It was a perfect, logical, and efficient solution. You had deconstructed the human ghost, and now you were wearing its skin. You were certain of your victory. You had found their greatest weakness. You were about to turn it into the weapon of their own annihilation. You had made only one miscalculation. You understood their fear. But you did not understand what that fear could create. Your campaign of terror was devastatingly effective. At first, human society began to fray at the edges. They saw your phantoms everywhere. Their global communication channels became a chaotic mess of false reports and panicked speculation. They were jumping at shadows. Your strategy was working perfectly. They were being consumed by a weapon made of nothing. You projected ghost fleets into their space, thousands of Concorde vessels appearing on their long-range sensors, vast armadas that would trigger global alerts. They would scramble their remaining defenses. They would aim their weapons at the empty void. Then, just as suddenly, your ghost fleets would vanish, leaving behind only confusion and exhausted dread. Your infiltrator programs whispered in their networks. They fabricated evidence. They created false orders. They made generals doubt their commanders. They made citizens doubt their leaders. You turned their own information systems into a hall of mirrors. They could no longer trust what they saw or heard. Their own technology was lying to them. This was the pinnacle of logical warfare. You were defeating an enemy without a single casualty. You were using their own irrationality as the fulcrum to break them. The apex monitored the data streams with serene approval. The human collapse was proceeding on schedule. Any day now, they would break. They would broadcast their surrender. But the surrender never came. Instead, something else began to happen. Something your models had not predicted. A human admiral, a woman named Aisha Tanaka, gave a public address. Your systems monitored it closely. You expected a plea, a resignation. Instead, she looked into the camera, and she told her people to stop trusting their sensors. She told them to assume that everything they saw was a lie. She said, "The enemy is fighting with shadows, so we must learn to fight in the dark." This was a turning point. You had intended to make them paranoid. You succeeded, but you had not anticipated the result. Their paranoia evolved. It became a tool. They stopped trusting their machines, and they started trusting their instincts. Their flawed, illogical, emotional instincts. Their fleets stopped responding to your ghost signatures. When a massive conquered armada appeared on their screens, they held their fire. They waited. They learned to distinguish the echo of a real ship from the ghost of a fake one. Your weapon of deception was forcing them to become better, sharpening their senses. Then they began to fight back, not with weapons, but with your own tactics. Your own perfect, infallible sensors began to report anomalies. A human fleet massing behind their planet, Jupiter, a fleet that your gravity detectors confirmed. Your ships moved to intercept. But when they arrived, there was nothing there. Just a collection of debris, and a handful of transmitters mimicking the mass signature of a fleet. The humans had learned to lie to your machines. They flooded the solar system with noise. They broadcasted gigabytes of useless data, old television shows, stock market reports from a century ago, endless readings of their most boring literature. It was an ocean of static designed to hide their real movements. Your analysts, once tasked with finding meaning in their chaos, were now drowning in it. You had created a weapon made of nothing, and now they were using that nothingness as a shield, as a sword. Your perfect vision was clouded. Your certainties were eroding. You could no longer be sure of what was real and what was a human fabrication. One of your patrol vessels was tracking a single human scout ship. The scout was damaged, leaking radiation. It was an easy target. The patrol ship moved in for the kill, but as it got closer, the scout ship's signature changed. It grew. It morphed. Suddenly, your patrol ship was facing what appeared to be an entire human battle group. It was a trick, a simple projection, a clever manipulation of sensor data. But the patrol ship's consciousness hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was a new phenomenon for the Concorde, a moment of uncertainty. In that moment, the real human ships, hiding in the static, attacked. They were no longer throwing rocks. They had learned. They targeted your ship's propulsion systems, its communication arrays. They did not try to destroy it. They tried to capture it, to dissect it, to learn its secrets. The patrol vessel escaped, but it was damaged. And it brought back a chilling realization. Your weapon had been turned against you. The very thing you thought was their greatest weakness, their familiarity with fear, with doubt, with the unknown, had become their most potent defense. They were comfortable living in a world of lies. You were not. You, the Concorde, the serene empire of logic, were now fighting shadows. You looked out into the darkness of their system, and for the first time, you were not entirely sure what you were seeing. The ghost you had unleashed was no longer yours to control. It now haunted you, and you were beginning to understand the very human concept of dread.